My name is Tyler Brooks. I'm 30 years old, and this happened last summer in Tillamook State Forest, Oregon. I still don't know if I believe in the supernatural, but after what I saw, it doesn't really matter. Some things in this world are worse than ghosts. It started as a road trip to reconnect with my best friend, Mark Henderson. We'd been tight since we were kids, but life, screwed up choices really, pulled us apart. Mark was always the dreamer, the risk taker, and I was the guy who picked up the pieces when things fell apart. He'd lost his job, his fiancée left him, and he figured an RV trip through Oregon's backwoods would be the perfect escape. I agreed, hoping maybe we could patch things up. But I should have trusted my gut. Something felt wrong the moment we took that detour off Highway 6. We were driving along the Wilson River Highway, a stretch of road locals call Dead Man's Curve because of how many people have crashed or disappeared around there. The rain had just started, the kind of misty drizzle that slicks up the road without you noticing. Mark was at the wheel, blasting some shitty rock playlist while I kept my eyes on the winding road ahead. "Dude, relax," Mark laughed, noticing how tense I was. "We're in an RV, not a race car." "Yeah, well, maybe if you'd fix the brakes like I told you, I could relax." Mark waved me off, his typical response. But less than a mile later, we hit that infamous curve, and everything went to hell. The RV lurched as Mark slammed on the brakes. Except nothing happened. We were sliding, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt, and before either of us could react, we crashed through a guardrail and into the forest. The world spun, metal groaned, and when we finally stopped, we were tilted sideways, the front of the RV buried in a mess of mud and ferns. For a minute, neither of us spoke. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "You okay?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Mark nodded, rubbing his head. "Yeah, you?" "Yeah." I looked around, realizing how deep we were in the woods. No cell service, the RV wasn't going anywhere. We're screwed. Mark tried to laugh it off, but there was an edge to it. "We'll figure it out." We packed up some supplies, flashlights, a couple of water bottles, and a crappy map, and set out on foot, hoping to find help. After about an hour of trudging through the dense forest, we stumbled onto an old logging road. That's when we met her. She was standing in the middle of the path like she'd been waiting for us. A woman in her late 20s, long dark hair sticking to her face from the rain. She wore a torn hiking jacket and had a backpack slung over one shoulder. "You guys lost?" she asked, her voice calm, too calm for someone alone in the woods. Mark, being Mark, gave her his trademark grin. "You could say that. RV broke down. You know if there's a town nearby?" She hesitated for a second, then pointed down the road. "Gales Creek, maybe a couple miles that way." "Perfect," Mark said, already walking ahead. But I noticed the way she looked at him, like she was studying him, weighing something in her mind. I hung back. "You okay? You out here alone?" She nodded, but her eyes darted toward the trees. "Yeah, got separated from my group. This forest, it's not safe at night." I should have paid more attention to that warning. Her name was Clara, and she decided to tag along with us to Gales Creek. The closer we got to town, the more the woods felt off. I can't explain it. The trees felt like they were closing in, and the deeper we went, the quieter it got, like the forest was holding its breath. Gales Creek wasn't on any map I'd ever seen. It was a tiny cluster of old, weather-beaten buildings, like something out of the 1930s. No cars, no people, just silence. We found a diner, the kind with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that barely lit the foggy air. Inside, a few locals sat at the counter, staring at us like we'd crawled out from under a rock. One of them, an older man with a face like leather and eyes too sharp to be friendly, stood up. You boys need help? Our RV broke down, Mark said. Brakes went out on the curve. The man nodded slowly. Dead man's curve claims another. We'll get you sorted. Something in his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Clara tugged at my sleeve. We shouldn't be here, she whispered. They're worse than the forest. Before I could ask what she meant, Mark was already shaking the old man's hand, thanking him for his help. Big mistake. The next thing I remember, we were in the back of a truck, hands bound, heads throbbing from whatever they'd knocked us out with. Mark was beside me, groggy and confused. What the hell? He started, but I shushed him. We were being taken to an old logging mill on the edge of town. They dragged us into a basement that smelled like rust and something sweet, like rotten meat. The walls were lined with tools, axes, saws, knives. But it wasn't the tools that made my stomach turn. It was the symbols carved into the wood, strange, jagged marks that looked ancient. That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with some backwoods psychos. These people were part of something older, darker, a cult called the Red Birch. Clara was right. They didn't just kill people, they transformed them. Mark was the first to be taken. They forced him into a chair, strapped him down, and made him eat something. I couldn't see what it was, but the smell was enough to make me gag. He fought at first, but after a while his resistance faded. His eyes changed, lost that spark of defiance. When they brought him back, he wasn't the same. He was quieter, his movements jerky, like he wasn't fully in control of his own body. Clara found me that night. She claimed she never wanted this, that she was trying to escape the cult. I didn't know if I could trust her, but she had a knife, and that was good enough for me. We planned our escape, but when we tried to get Mark, he snapped. He attacked me with a strength I didn't know he had, his eyes wild, his mouth twisted into something that wasn't a smile. "Stay," he growled. "It's better here. You'll see." I had no choice. I fought him off, tears blinding my vision, and ran. Clara led me through the forest, but even as we fled, I knew I wasn't safe. The cult would find us. Mark would find us. We made it back to the highway by dawn, flagged down a trucker who called the cops. But when we returned with the authorities, Gales Creek was gone. No buildings, no people, just trees where the town had been. Mark was gone too. I still don't know if Clara was telling the truth. Sometimes I wonder if she led me out just to bring me back later. But one thing I know for sure, Mark's still out there. And he's not the friend I once knew. I hear his voice sometimes in the dead of night, calling me back. My name is Laura Mitchell. I'm 33 years old, and last summer I took an RV trip through Umpqua National Forest in Oregon. I thought I was escaping my grief, finding peace in the wilderness after my sister Katie died. But I was wrong. The forest wasn't peaceful, it was waiting. Katie's death had hollowed me out. She died in a car accident 6 months before, and no matter how many times people told me it wasn't my fault, I couldn't shake the guilt. I was supposed to pick her up that night, but I bailed last minute, too caught up in work. She took an Uber, and the rest, well, you know how that story ends. Photography had always been my escape, so I packed up my RV, grabbed my camera gear, and hit the road, hoping the beauty of Oregon's wilderness would dull the ache in my chest. I wanted to capture places untouched by tourists. Waterfalls hidden deep in the forest, forgotten trails, the kind of quiet beauty Katie used to love. I arrived at Umpqua National Forest on a cool, overcast afternoon. The trees loomed tall and ancient, their needles whispering in the breeze. I found a remote campsite near the North Umpqua Trail, surrounded by towering pines. No other campers in sight. Just me, my RV, and miles of forest. Perfect. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked, took photos, and tried to lose myself in the rhythm of nature. But that night, as I sat in the RV editing photos, I heard something. Faint, almost like the wind, but not quite. It was a whisper. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Grief plays tricks on you, makes you hear things, see things. But the whisper grew louder, distinct enough to make me freeze. It was Katie's voice. Laura. I shut my laptop and stared into the dark woods outside my window. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I told myself it was just the wind, just my mind messing with me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. I hiked further down the trail, hoping exercise would clear my head. That's when I stumbled upon it, an old, abandoned ranger station, hidden behind a thicket of overgrown bushes. The building was weathered and sagging, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. Old papers littered the floor, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. Jagged, unnatural marks that made my skin crawl. In one corner, I found a rusted filing cabinet, its drawers half open. Inside were reports of missing hikers, dating back decades. Dozens of names, all marked never found. As I flipped through the reports, I felt it again, the whisper. Laura, come find me. I dropped the papers and stumbled out of the station, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't possible. Katie was dead. She was dead. I hurried back to my RV, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But that night the whispers returned. Louder, closer. Laura, I need you. I barely slept. By morning, my nerves were shot, and I decided it was time to leave. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine had sputtered and died. I checked the battery, nothing wrong. I tried the satellite phone, no signal. It had worked perfectly the day before. Panic clawed at my chest. I was completely alone, stranded miles from civilization, and something in the woods wanted me to stay. That night, I heard footsteps outside the RV. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, heart racing as the footsteps circled the vehicle. I peeked through the window but saw nothing. Just the dense, oppressive darkness of the forest. Then I heard it. Right outside the door. Laura, it's me. Let me in. It was Katie's voice. But it wasn't her voice, it was wrong. Flat, hollow, like someone was mimicking her but didn't quite know how to sound human. I locked the door and backed away, clutching a kitchen knife in trembling hands. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like hours, and finally I collapsed onto the floor, exhausted and terrified. When I woke the next morning, I found something on the ground outside the RV. It was Katie's necklace, the same one she was wearing the night she died. I should have left it there. I should have run into the woods away from everything. But I picked it up, and the moment my fingers touched the cold metal, the whispers returned, clearer than ever. Come to me, Laura. I'm waiting. I don't remember making the decision to leave the RV, but suddenly I was walking. The necklace clutched in my hand. The forest felt different, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches brushing against my shoulders like fingers. The whispers guided me, leading me deeper into the forest, past the ranger station, into an area where the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sun. The air grew colder, heavier, and I felt like I was wading through something unseen. That's when I saw them. Scattered across the forest floor were belongings. Backpacks, cameras, clothing, all rusted and rotting from age. But what made me stop cold were the bones. Human bones. arranged in patterns, spirals, and circles, like some kind of ritual. And in the center of it all, I saw her. Katie. She stood there, wearing the same clothes from the night she died, her face pale and expressionless. But her eyes, they weren't hers. They were empty, dark pits that seemed to pull at me, sucking the air from my lungs. "Laura," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. "Stay with me. We can be together again." I took a step forward, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to believe it was her. I needed to believe it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't Katie. It was something else. I forced myself to step back, shaking my head. "You're not real," I whispered. "You're not her." The thing wearing my sister's face let out a screech, a sound that didn't belong in this world. The forest around me seemed to shudder, the trees groaning as if in pain. I turned and ran, my breath burning in my lungs, the whispers chasing me like shadows. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station. Desperation drove me inside, and I did the only thing I could think of. I set it on fire. The flames roared to life, devouring the old wood and paper. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe and twist in the heat, and I felt the forest scream around me. The air grew thick with smoke and something else, something foul and ancient. I barely made it out before the entire building collapsed in on itself. The whispers faded, but I knew it wasn't over. I stumbled back to the RV, bruised and battered, and found the engine miraculously working. I didn't question it. I just drove, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. But the whispers never really left me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Katie's voice, soft and distant, calling me back to the forest. And part of me wonders if, one day, I'll answer. My name is Greg Mitchell, and I'm 45 years old. This happened last summer in Hell's Canyon, right on the Oregon-Idaho border. I'm writing this down because I need people to know what's out there. What we went through wasn't some backwoods misunderstanding. It wasn't a camping trip gone wrong. It was evil, pure human evil. It started as a family vacation. I thought it would be good for us. After years buried in a cubicle, missing birthdays, anniversaries, and every little moment in between, I figured a road trip through Oregon would bring us back together. My wife, Lisa, was hesitant, but supportive as always. Our daughter, Sophie, 17, rolled her eyes more times than I could count, and Ethan, our 10-year-old son, was just excited to be anywhere that wasn't a classroom. We had this beat-up old RV I'd bought secondhand, patched up with more duct tape than I'd admit. But it was ours. We drove through the Cascades, stopped at Crater Lake, and finally headed towards Hell's Canyon, where I planned to take them hiking and fishing. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd show them I still knew how to take care of them, that I wasn't just some office stiff. But I was wrong. The GPS cut out about 50 miles from the canyon. No big deal. I had paper maps, old school, but Sophie wouldn't let it go. "Dad, seriously, we're in the middle of nowhere and you're trusting maps?" I ignored her. Lisa gave me that look, the one that says, "Pick your battles." But I was stubborn. I wanted to prove something. So, when I saw an unmarked dirt road that looked like a shortcut, I took it. The road narrowed, the trees crowding in close. The RV groaned over rocks and potholes. Ethan pressed his face to the window, wide-eyed. "Dad, look!" He pointed at something rusting in the trees. A car, half buried, its window shattered. "Probably abandoned," I muttered, but even I felt a chill. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were deep in it. I pulled over into a clearing that looked decent enough for the night. The RV sputtered as I turned off the engine. That was the first thing that felt off. We set up camp, built a small fire, and tried to enjoy the night. But the woods felt wrong. Too quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the crackle of the fire and our forced conversation. That's when Ethan found it. "Dad, what's this?" He held up a piece of wood about the size of his forearm, with strange symbols carved into it. Circles intersecting triangles, jagged lines cutting through. It wasn't anything I recognized, but it looked old, weathered. Lisa brushed it off. "Probably some kid's art project, sweetie." But I felt my skin crawl. Later that night, as we settled into the RV, Sophie started up again. "This is so stupid. No service, no signal. We're literally in deliverance territory." She huffed and grabbed her flashlight. "I'm going for a walk." "No, you're not," I snapped, but she was already out the door, slamming it behind her. Lisa touched my arm. "Give her 5 minutes, she'll come back." But 5 minutes turned into 10. 10 into 30. When an hour passed, I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the woods, calling her name. Lisa followed, panic in her voice. Ethan stayed in the RV, too scared to come. We found Sophie's phone about 100 yards from the campsite, lying face down in the dirt. Next to it was a piece of fabric, her hoodie, torn and smeared with something dark. That's when we saw the lights. Off in the distance, through the trees, a warm glow flickered. A house, maybe. I felt relief wash over me. Maybe Sophie found help. We followed the light, stumbling into a small clearing where a cluster of old cabins stood. Faint music drifted from one of them, the smell of wood smoke and something else. Something metallic, like rust and blood. A man stepped out of the largest cabin, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall, thin, with sunken cheeks and eyes that didn't seem to blink enough. "Well, hey there," he drawled, smiling wide. "Y'all lost?" I should have turned back right then, but Sophie was missing and we needed help. "Our daughter," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "She's missing. We think she might have come this way." The man's eyes flicked between us. "Haven't seen no girl," he said, but his smile didn't fade. "But come in, warm up. We'll help you look." Inside, the cabin smelled worse, like meat gone bad. The walls were lined with old hunting trophies, dusty and cracked. A woman stirred a pot over the fire, glancing at us with the same too-wide smile. They offered us food, told us their generator had extra fuel we could use. But I noticed things. A necklace on the mantel that looked like Sophie's. A boot, small and familiar, tucked under a chair. My stomach turned to ice. I pulled Lisa aside. "We need to leave now." But before we could move, the door slammed shut. The man from before stood there holding a rusted axe. "Y'all ain't going nowhere." They came at us fast. I fought, but they were prepared. They knocked Lisa out first, then me. The last thing I saw was Ethan's terrified face peeking through the RV window as they dragged us underground. The cellar was cold, damp, and smelled like death. They tied us to rusted pipes, laughing as they told us about their tradition, how they fed on outsiders to keep the land strong. They called it a cleansing. They tortured me first, cut into my skin, forcing Lisa to watch. They wanted us to confess our sins, to purify ourselves before they ate us. But I held on, thinking of Ethan, praying he was still free. Hours, maybe days passed, time blurred. But then I heard it, a commotion above, shouts, a gunshot. Ethan. Somehow, that brave little boy had escaped, found help, or at least caused enough chaos to give us a chance. I don't remember how I got free. The adrenaline took over. I fought like I hadn't fought since my military days, breaking bones, feeling knives slip into flesh, mine and theirs. Lisa found Sophie, battered but alive, locked in a separate room. We stumbled out into the night, stealing one of their trucks, driving until the canyon was just a memory in the rearview mirror. We made it to a ranger station by dawn. But Greg, me, I didn't make it. The wounds were too deep. I'm writing this because I need people to know. The authorities found nothing when they went back. Just ashes and empty cabins. But I know they're still out there. And sometimes, when the nights are quiet, Lisa swears she sees those same symbols carved into trees, into doors, into the corners of her dreams. We escaped Hell's Canyon, but Hell's Canyon didn't escape us. My name is Sam Rivers, and I'm 38 years old. This happened last fall in Malheur National Forest, Oregon. I didn't believe in ghost stories before this trip. I don't think I had the luxury of believing. I always figured the worst things out there were people. I was wrong. After my divorce, I packed up my RV and left Portland with nothing but my camera and a cooler full of cheap beer. I wasn't looking for adventure. I just needed to breathe again, away from city lights and suffocating memories. Malheur was supposed to be quiet, untouched, a place to get lost without really getting lost. But that's exactly what happened. I rolled into the forest late in the afternoon, following the GPS as it zigzagged through dirt roads that looked less like trails and more like forgotten logging routes. I should have known something was off when the signal cut out, and the map rerouted me down a narrow path that wasn't on any of my printed maps. But I've always trusted tech more than gut feelings. I set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines that blotted out most of the sky. It was perfect, or it should have been. As I unloaded my camera gear, I noticed weird carvings in the trees. Triangles inside circles, like some kind of crude geometry lesson. I figured it was some hiker's idea of fun. Maybe kids playing with knives. I took a few photos, thinking I'd Google it later, and then cracked open a beer, watching the forest swallow the sun. That night, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the forest was too still. No rustling leaves, no distant howls, just this low, hushed murmuring that seemed to move around the RV, circling it like a predator. I told myself it was in my head. I even laughed about it, thinking maybe I'd had one beer too many. But my laugh felt hollow in the dark. The next morning, I found footprints around the RV. Bare feet. Small, like a child's, but the toes were elongated, almost claw-like. I told myself it was a trick of the light, shadows playing games, but deep down, something gnawed at me. I tried to shake it off and grabbed my camera, heading deeper into the woods. I hiked for hours, but no matter which direction I went, I ended up back at the RV. It didn't make sense. I marked trees with bright orange tape, but the markers would disappear, only to reappear somewhere else. It was like the forest was shifting, rearranging itself when I wasn't looking. That's when I met her. I was about to give up and head back when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A woman, maybe in her early 30s, wearing hiking gear that looked too clean for someone lost in the woods. She had long, dark hair that fell over her shoulders, and her eyes were too bright, almost reflective. "Hey," she called out, waving. "You wouldn't happen to know the way out of here, would you?" Her voice was light, almost musical, but something about it felt off, like she was trying too hard to sound normal. Still, I was desperate for human contact. "Depends," I called back. "You lost?" She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Aren't we all?" We introduced ourselves. She said her name was Mara, and decided to stick together for a bit. She claimed she'd been hiking with friends, but they'd gotten separated. Her story was vague, full of holes, but I didn't push. I was just glad I wasn't alone. For the first few hours, it felt almost normal. We talked about nothing: music, books, the usual small talk you share with strangers. But as the day wore on, I started noticing things. Mara never ate or drank, even though she carried a full pack. She'd vanish for long stretches, only to reappear without a sound. And sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, her smile would drop, and her eyes would go cold, like she was studying me. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time, and closer. I lay awake in the RV, staring at the ceiling, while Mara slept outside by the fire. Or at least, that's what I thought. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the roof of the RV. Light, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth. My blood turned to ice. I peeked out the window, but the fire was out, and Mara was gone. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, maybe stress, maybe leftover anxiety from the divorce. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, Mara acted like nothing had happened. She suggested we explore deeper into the forest, towards an old cabin she suddenly remembered seeing before she got lost. I should have said no. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put. But something about her, maybe those bright, too shiny eyes, made it hard to think straight. Like I was being pulled along by invisible strings. The cabin was worse than I imagined. It sat crooked, half swallowed by the forest, its wooden walls rotting and covered in those same strange symbols I'd seen on the trees. The air around it felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. "We can rest here," Mara said, her voice too cheerful. I hesitated at the door, every instinct screaming to run. But before I could move, she pushed me inside. The door slammed shut behind me. The cabin was filled with things: old clothes, rusted tools, and photos. Dozens of photos. I picked one up, my hands shaking. It was a picture of me standing by my RV taken from the tree line. I flipped through the others, and my heart dropped. Photos of other people, campers, hikers, all of them staring into the camera with wide, terrified eyes. Some of the photos were decades old, but the fear was the same. That's when I heard her voice behind me. "You should have stayed lost, Sam." I spun around, but Mara wasn't Mara anymore. Her skin sagged, her eyes sunken and hollow. Her mouth stretched too wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. The Hag of Malheur. The stories I dismissed as folklore were standing right in front of me. She lunged, and I barely dodged, grabbing my camera in a panic. I didn't know what else to do, so I hit the flash. The bright light filled the room, and for a moment she recoiled, shrieking like the light burned her. It gave me enough time to bolt out the door. The forest wasn't done with me yet. The trees seemed to close in, branches clawing at my face and arms. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in front of the RV. Somehow, it had been moved. It wasn't where I left it. But I didn't care. I scrambled inside, locking the doors, praying it would start. It didn't. The symbols were carved into the dashboard now, glowing faintly in the dim light. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, screaming in frustration when I heard it. A soft whisper right in my ear. "Stay." I turned, expecting to see the hag, but the RV was empty. Just me and my pounding heart. I don't remember how I got out. Maybe it was sheer luck. Maybe the forest got bored of me. But somehow, I managed to get the RV started and drove until the trees thinned and the signal bars returned to my phone. I made it back to civilization, but I wasn't the same. When I developed the photos from the trip, my blood ran cold. In every picture, Mara stood beside me, smiling that too wide smile. Even in the shots I knew I'd taken alone. But the worst part, one photo showed me, deep in the woods, staring back at the camera with hollow, black eyes. I don't go camping anymore, I don't leave the city, but sometimes, when the nights are too quiet, I hear whispers outside my apartment window, and I know the Hag of Malheur is still out there, waiting. My name is Derek Vaughn, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, Oregon, about 6 months ago. I still don't know if what I experienced was real, or if my mind cracked under the pressure of being alone out there. But I have the scars. I have the memories. And sometimes at night I still hear her voice. I was driving my RV across the Pacific Northwest, documenting ghost stories and urban legends for my travel blog. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me busy and sober. I'd been off the bottle for a little over a year, and I needed the distraction. I'd heard whispers about the disappearing road in an online forum. A phantom road in Rogue River where people vanished without a trace. It sounded like bullshit, but the story was good clickbait. I figured I'd check it out, snap some photos, and write it off as another tall tale spun by locals with too much time on their hands. The day I arrived, the weather was typical Oregon. Overcast, with a damp chill that crept into your bones. I stopped at a gas station on the edge of the forest to top off the tank before heading in. The place was almost empty, except for an old man sitting by the window, sipping black coffee from a cracked mug. He watched me as I paid for gas and a pack of gum. "You headin' into the forest?" he asked, his voice gravelly like he'd smoked a pack a day since the 60s. "Yeah," I replied casually, pocketing my change, "chasing ghost stories." The old man chuckled, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "If you hear a voice on the road, don't follow it. Some roads out here don't lead anywhere you want to go." I gave him a polite nod and left, chalking it up to the kind of local color I'd write about later. But his words stuck with me. I drove into the forest, following the GPS deeper into the wilderness. The trees grew denser, the road narrower. After about an hour, the GPS signal flickered, then cut out completely. I wasn't worried. I had maps and a pretty good sense of direction. But then I started noticing weird things. The road signs didn't make sense. I passed the same sign twice, Dead Man's Curve 1 mile, even though I hadn't turned around. My compass spun uselessly on the dash, and the landmarks felt wrong. Trees were gnarled in strange shapes like they were leaning in to watch me. That's when the CB radio crackled to life. "Hello? Is anyone out there? Please, I need help." I froze. The voice was faint, female, shaky with panic. I grabbed the mic. "This is Derek. Where are you?" There was a pause, static hissing in my ear. Then, I don't know. My RV broke down. I'm on a road that doesn't show up on my map. Please, I'm scared." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. This was too perfect, too much like the stories I'd read online. But what if it was real? What if someone actually needed help? "Can you describe where you are?" I asked. It's just trees. The road keeps turning back on itself. I see the same things over and over. I think I saw you drive by." My heart skipped. I hadn't passed anyone. The road had been empty for miles. "What's your name?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "Cassie," she whispered. "Please don't leave me here." I should have turned back. I should have ignored the voice and driven to the nearest ranger station. But I didn't. I told myself I was helping, but deep down, I think I just wanted to prove the legend wrong. I followed her directions, or what I thought were her directions. The road twisted unnaturally, looping back in ways that made no sense. I passed the same broken tree 3 times, even though I'd been driving straight. The forest grew darker, the daylight fading too fast. Then I saw it. An unmarked road veered off to the right, one I could have sworn hadn't been there before. My headlights caught the edge of tire tracks in the dirt, like someone had recently driven through. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I turned down the road. It was like entering another world. The trees were taller here, their branches knitting together above like a canopy, blocking out the sky. The road narrowed until the RV barely fit, scraping against the overgrown brush. The further I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the hum of the engine and my own heartbeat. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A battered RV, half hidden in the trees, its door hanging open. I pulled up beside it and grabbed my flashlight. "Cassie?" I called out. No answer. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The place smelled like mildew and something sour. It was abandoned, but not for long. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, mold creeping over the edges. Clothes were scattered around, and a notebook lay open on the counter. I flipped through it. The handwriting was frantic, the words growing messier as the pages went on. "The road won't let me leave." I hear my own voice on the radio. It's watching me. A cold sweat broke over my skin. I backed out of the RV, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. That's when I heard it, my own voice crackling over the CB radio in my RV. "Derek," it whispered, "help me." I sprinted back to my RV, slamming the door shut behind me. The radio hissed and popped, my voice repeating the same phrase over and over. "Help me. Help me." I yanked the mic out, but the voice kept going, growing louder, more distorted. The mirrors in the RV fogged over, and when I wiped them clean, my reflection didn't move. It just stared back at me, eyes dark and hollow. I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The dashboard lights flickered and the gauges spun wildly. I felt the RV shift, like it was being pulled deeper into the woods. Panicking, I grabbed my keys and bolted into the forest, running blindly through the trees. The whispers followed me, growing louder, filling my head until I couldn't think. I stumbled, fell, and when I looked up, I was back at the RV. But it wasn't my RV. It was the same one I'd found earlier, the abandoned one. Only now, the door was closed and the lights were on. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the window, I saw someone sitting at the table. Someone who looked exactly like me. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes of running, screaming, the forest swallowing me whole. When I finally stumbled out of the trees, I collapsed on the side of a highway, gasping for breath. A trucker found me and called for help. The rangers searched the area, but they found nothing. No abandoned RV, no strange road, nothing. They said I must have gotten turned around, spent too much time alone in the woods. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I haven't been back on the road since. I sold the RV and moved into an apartment in the city. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the static of a CB radio crackling in the dark. And my own voice whispering from the shadows. "Help me." My name is Mark Evans. I'm 29 years old, and I shouldn't be here to tell you this story. It happened last summer in Clatsop State Forest, Oregon. If you're thinking of going there, don't. Stay the hell away. Liam was the one who planned the trip. He always did. Mr. Adventurer. He thought his camera could capture every wild thing in the world without consequence. We were supposed to be just 5 friends, camping out, drinking, making memories. But Liam, he always pushed too far. It was late August when we packed into Liam's beat-up RV. The thing looked like it had died before we made it out of Portland, but Liam swore it had one more trip in it. There was me, Liam, his girlfriend Sarah, her best friend Emily, and Derek, the wild card. The guy you keep around for the laughs until his drinking becomes a problem. Our destination? An old logging road deep in Clatsop State Forest near Astoria. Liam had read about some abandoned campsites out there, perfect for his photography portfolio. None of us questioned him. Not then. The trip started fine. We laughed, blasted music, shared stories. But as we veered off the main highway onto the forest roads, The vibe shifted. Trees pressed close against the road, their shadows stretching like fingers. The GPS flickered, then died. No signal. "Relax," Liam said, grinning. "That's the point, right? Getting off the grid?" Sarah shot him a glare. "Just don't get us lost." Derek cracked a beer and chuckled. "What's life without a little danger?" By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, we were definitely lost. The RV groaned as it trudged down a narrow, overgrown path. Liam insisted it was the right way, but when the road ended in a thicket of brush, we knew we were screwed. "I told you this thing wouldn't make it," Sarah hissed. "Chill. We'll camp here tonight and figure it out in the morning," Liam said, as if it were just another bump in his grand adventure. We set up camp beside the RV, the thick silence of the forest swallowing our voices. That night, as we sat around a flickering fire, the woods felt wrong. No insects chirping, no wind, just a heavy, unnatural stillness. That's when we heard it. The first sign. A whistle. Soft, distant, like someone mimicking a tune. We froze, eyes darting into the darkness. "You hear that?" Emily whispered. "Probably just wind," Liam said too quickly. But there was no wind. The next morning, we discovered our supplies had been tampered with. A couple of food containers were missing. Footprints, not ours, circled the RV. Bare feet. "This isn't funny," Sarah snapped, looking at Derek. "Wasn't me," Derek muttered, but his eyes were uneasy. We argued about leaving, but Liam insisted on pressing deeper. "We're probably close to the old campsites," he said. "Might find someone who knows the area." Reluctantly, we followed him. By late afternoon, we stumbled upon an old, rotting cabin tucked between towering pines. It looked abandoned, but the door hung slightly open, swaying in the breeze. "Let's check it out," Liam said, camera already in hand. "I'm not going in there," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. But Liam was already pushing through the door. I hesitated, then followed. The cabin reeked of decay. Animal bones littered the floor. Symbols were carved into the walls, crude, primitive shapes I didn't recognize. Something dark stained the wood, and I didn't want to know what it was. "Jesus," I whispered. Liam snapped photos like a man possessed. "This is amazing." It wasn't amazing, it was a warning. That night, Derek vanished. We woke to find his sleeping bag empty, beer cans scattered where he'd been sitting. At first, we thought he'd wandered off drunk, but as we searched, dread sank in. Near the cabin, we found his hat. It was torn and soaked in something dark. We called out for him, our voices swallowed by the trees. Then we heard it again, the whistle. Closer this time. Sarah grabbed Liam's arm, panic in her eyes. "We need to leave, now!" But it was too late. We were ambushed at dusk. Figures emerged from the trees, faces hidden behind crude masks made of bark and bone. They moved fast, like shadows, overwhelming us before we could scream. I fought, I swear I did. But something heavy cracked against my skull, and the world spun into darkness. When I woke, I was in the cabin's cellar, tied to a splintered post. The air was thick with rot. I could hear Liam groaning nearby, his leg bent at a sickening angle. Sarah was there too, gagged, her eyes wide with terror. But Emily wasn't tied up. She stood in the corner, talking in low tones to one of them. I couldn't make out the words, but her body language. It wasn't fear, it was familiarity. When she turned to us, her face was blank. Cold. "Emily?" I croaked, my throat raw. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked over to Liam, crouching beside him. "I tried to warn you," she whispered, stroking his hair. "But you never listen, Liam. You never listen to anyone." His eyes widened as realization hit. You knew? Emily smiled, a sad, twisted thing. I grew up near here. These are my people. You don't belong here. She stood and nodded to the masked figures. They dragged Liam from the room, his screams echoing as they hauled him up the stairs. Sarah sobbed, thrashing against her restraints. I couldn't move, I couldn't think. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before the screams stopped. When they dragged Liam back down, he was barely recognizable. Bloodied, broken, he didn't move. They dumped him beside us like garbage. Sarah was next. I don't know how I escaped. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was Emily's guilt. One of the ropes around my wrists was loose. While they were busy upstairs, I slipped free. I wanted to save Sarah, I swear I did, but I could hear her screams, high, piercing, inhuman, and I knew I was too late. I ran. I ran like the devil himself was on my heels, through the trees, over roots and rocks, my breath burning in my chest. I didn't stop until I hit the road and flagged down a trucker. The cops didn't believe me, said we were probably messing around with drugs. They searched the forest, but they found nothing. No cabin, no signs of struggle, no bodies. Emily was gone. And Derek, Liam, and Sarah? Just names on a missing persons report, but I know the truth. They're still out there, waiting. My name is Daniel Harris. I'm 42 years old, and I don't know if I'm the same man who drove into Umpqua National Forest last fall. It was supposed to be a break, a chance to clear my head after the divorce. I'd been a high school history teacher for nearly 20 years, but none of that prepared me for losing everything. My wife, my daughter, my home. So I packed up my old RV, a rickety '98 Winnebago, and drove into the heart of Oregon's wilderness. I thought solitude would be healing. I was wrong. The plan was simple. Park near the hot springs. Spend a few days off-grid, maybe start writing that book I'd been thinking about for years. But the forest had other ideas. The first sign that something was wrong came before I even entered the park. I stopped at a rundown gas station in a small town I can't even remember the name of. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Flickering neon lights, peeling paint, the whole deal. The old man behind the counter, with skin like cracked leather and eyes too sharp for his age, rang me up without a word. As I turned to leave, he muttered, "Don't camp near the hot springs, they whisper at night." I laughed it off, just some local superstition, but now I can still hear those whispers. By late afternoon, I was deep in Umpqua National Forest. The trees grew denser, their moss-covered limbs stretching like bony fingers across the narrow road. Fog crept in, curling around the base of the trees and making the world feel smaller, quieter. My GPS died about an hour in, but I'd printed a map, thinking I was being smart. Turns out paper maps don't do much when they get soaked in rain. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a hot spring. It was perfect, isolated, peaceful. I parked the RV, set up camp, and watched the mist rise off the water as the sun dipped behind the trees. That first night, I slept like a baby. The second night, I heard the whispers. They started faint, like wind rustling through pine needles. But as I lay there, staring at the RV ceiling, I realized the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It wasn't the wind. I sat up, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, circling the RV, brushing against the thin metal walls. They said my name, Daniel. I shot out of bed, heart pounding. Grabbing my flashlight, I swung open the door, expecting to catch some pranksters sneaking around, but there was nothing. Just the forest. Silent. Still. I chalked it up to nerves. Isolation can play tricks on the mind, right? But the next morning, things were off. My coffee mug, the one I always set on the counter, was sitting outside on the RV's step. My boots were damp, caked with mud, even though I hadn't left the RV during the night. And when I checked the door, it was locked from the inside. I told myself I was just tired, stressed. Maybe I'd wandered out in my sleep, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I decided to take a hike, clear my head. The forest was beautiful in a way that felt ancient, untouched. The fog clung to the ground, and the only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the damp leaves. That's when I found it. An old RV, rusted and covered in moss, tucked between the trees like it had been there for decades. But as I got closer, my stomach twisted into knots. It was identical to mine. Same model, same dents on the side panel. Even the faded sticker from my last road trip to Crater Lake was there, peeling at the edges. Heart pounding, I climbed inside. The air was thick with mold and rot. But what made my blood run cold was the photo on the dashboard. It was a picture of me and my daughter, Claire, from 3 years ago. The same photo I kept in my wallet. But this one was faded, the edges curled with age, like it had been sitting there for years. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I must have been hallucinating. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. I needed to get back to my RV, pack up and leave. But when I returned, my RV wasn't where I left it. Panic clawed at my chest. I retraced my steps, certain I'd made a wrong turn, but the forest seemed to shift around me. The paths unfamiliar, twisted. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. And then I saw it. My RV. But standing in front of it was me. At first, I thought it was a reflection, a trick of the light, but this version of me was wrong. His clothes were different, dirtier, torn. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were empty. He smiled. "Daniel," he whispered in my voice. I froze, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. He stepped closer, his movements jerky, unnatural. "You've been here before," he said, tilting his head like a curious animal. "You just don't remember." I turned and ran. Branches clawed at my face. Roots tangled around my feet, but I didn't stop. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just in the air, they were in my head. "Daniel." I don't know how long I ran before I collapsed. When I finally opened my eyes, it was dark. The forest was silent again, but the oppressive weight of something unseen pressed against my chest. I stumbled through the woods, my body aching, until I found a dirt road. Hours later, a ranger truck appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the fog like a lifeline. The ranger found me disoriented, rambling about doppelgangers and whispering woods. He took me back to town, where I tried to explain what happened. But when they went to search for my RV, they found nothing. No RV. No rusted twin. No evidence I'd ever been there. I tried calling my daughter, Claire, to tell her I was okay, but when she answered, her voice was cold, distant. "Who is this?" she asked. "It's me," I whispered. "It's Dad." She hung up. I looked at my reflection in the diner window that night, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the face staring back. It smiled when I didn't. My name is Grace Mitchell. I'm 35 years old, and I've spent the last 10 years traveling the country, writing about hidden places and forgotten roads. I've always chased the strange, the unexplained, the places locals whisper about but never visit. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found, or what found me, on Hell's Canyon Scenic Byway in eastern Oregon. It started like any other trip. I'd heard rumors of an unmarked stretch of road called the Devil's Bend, a place where people vanish without a trace. Locals blamed it on rock slides, bad weather, or just the rugged nature of the area. But others, Those with more superstitious leanings spoke of strange lights in the canyon, voices that called you by name, and a presence that made you forget who you were. It sounded like the perfect story. I drove my RV out there on a crisp October morning, the kind where the air feels like it's holding its breath. The road twisted through towering pines and jagged cliffs, the kind of beauty that hides danger just beneath the surface. I stopped at a small gas station in a town whose name I've forgotten. It was the only sign of life for miles. The old man behind the counter eyed me as I paid for gas and a stale cup of coffee. His skin looked like parchment stretched over bone, and his eyes, cloudy but sharp, followed me like he knew something I didn't. "You're not heading down to Devil's Bend, are you?" he asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. I smiled, trying to keep it light, thinking about it. Heard there's a good story out there. He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "Ain't no story worth what's down there. Folks don't come back right." I chuckled, brushing it off. I'd heard warnings like that before. Local color, part of the charm. But as I drove deeper into the forest, his words settled in the pit of my stomach like stones. I found a spot near an old overlook, just beyond where the official maps ended. The guardrails were rusted and twisted, like something had forced them apart. The air felt heavier here, as if the canyon itself was holding secrets in its jagged maw. I parked the RV and stepped outside, the wind carrying the faintest scent of something metallic, like old blood. That night, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, I sat by the fire, listening to the forest settle around me. It was too quiet, no crickets, no owls, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of my own breathing. And then I heard it, a voice. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the trees, but then it called my name. Grace. It was faint, almost gentle, like a lover whispering in the dark. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the isolation, the quiet playing tricks on my mind. But when I stood and scanned the darkness with my flashlight, the beam caught something. Movement. A shadow, just at the edge of the light, slipping back into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to hike along the ridge, hoping to shake the unease settling over me. The trail was barely there, overgrown and crumbling at the edges. As I walked, I noticed strange markings carved into the rocks, symbols I didn't recognize, worn by time and weather but still visible. About a mile in, I found the journal. It was half buried in the dirt near the edge of the overlook, its leather cover cracked and brittle. Inside, the pages were filled with neat handwriting, detailing a trip much like mine. The author spoke of hearing voices, seeing lights in the canyon, feeling watched. The last entry chilled me to the bone. It's calling me, I have to go. The date on the entry was from 5 years ago. That night, the lights appeared, flickering, just beyond the canyon's edge, like lanterns swaying in the wind. They moved in patterns, too deliberate to be random. I watched from the RV window, my breath fogging the glass, as the lights danced closer, closer until I could see their source. It wasn't lanterns. It was people, or at least they looked like people. But their movements were wrong, too smooth, like marionettes on invisible strings. Their faces were blank, pale reflections of humanity, and their eyes were empty. One of them stepped forward, closer to the RV, and my blood turned to ice. It was me. I stared at my own face, identical in every detail, but twisted into a grotesque smile. It raised a hand beckoning me forward. I slammed the curtains shut, heart racing, but the whispers seeped through the walls. Grace. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the steering wheel, waiting for morning. When the sun finally crept over the horizon, the lights were gone. but the footprints remained, circling the RV in the soft dirt. I should have left then. I should have packed up and driven as far from that place as possible, but something held me there. A pull, deep and insistent, like the canyon itself was inside me, whispering promises of answers, of understanding. By the third day, I was running out of supplies. My GPS was useless, spinning in circles, and my maps didn't match the terrain anymore. The forest felt different, like it was closing in. The trees leaning closer, the shadows deeper. That night, the voice changed. It wasn't just calling my name anymore. Grace, come home. It sounded like my mother, who'd been dead for 10 years. I tried to drown it out with music, with anything, but it was inside my head, clawing at my thoughts. I found myself standing at the canyon's edge, staring into the abyss, the wind cold against my skin. I don't remember how I got there. And then I saw her, standing in the canyon below, looking up at me with my own face. She smiled, a slow, creeping grin that didn't belong to me, and whispered, "It's better down here." I ran. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, trees rushing past, the taste of blood in my mouth, the sound of my own heartbeat like a drum in my ears. I must have passed out, because when I woke up, I was back in the RV, the sun high in the sky, but something was wrong. The photos on my camera weren't mine. They were of the canyon, yes, but from angles I'd never seen. Perspectives that weren't possible unless I'd been down there. And in every photo, I saw her. That twisted version of me, standing just out of focus, always smiling. I left that afternoon, driving until the forest thinned and the road straightened. I didn't stop until I saw the gas station again. The old man still behind the counter. He looked at me, eyes narrowing, and said, "You stayed too long." I didn't respond. I just drove. When I finally got home, I tried to write about it, to make sense of what happened. But every time I looked in the mirror, I saw her reflection staring back, smiling. My name is Anna Whitaker. I'm 29, and this happened last October when I was camping alone in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. I was out there chasing a story, something raw and real for my travel blog, Road Less Traveled. But what I found wasn't just a forgotten village or a good photo op. It was something much worse, something that followed me home. I'd heard about the place from a guy at a diner in Medford, an abandoned riverside village deep in the forest. He said it was cursed, but people love to throw that word around. I figured it was just some old ghost story locals used to scare off nosy tourists. Perfect clickbait material. So, I packed up my RV, grabbed my camera gear, and headed out. The first day was fine. The road into the forest was narrow, winding, but manageable. My GPS was glitchy, but that's nothing new when you're this deep in the woods. I found a clearing by the river, set up camp, and even managed to get some drone footage of the surrounding area. The village wasn't far, maybe a mile downstream. Just as I'd hoped, it was exactly the kind of forgotten place that would make my blog blow up. But the second night, things started getting weird. I was reviewing the drone footage in the RV, and I noticed something strange. In one of the clips just before the drone crashed, there was this figure standing by the riverbank. A woman, I think. She was hunched over, her face hidden by a tangle of wet, stringy hair. I didn't remember seeing anyone out there when I flew the drone. It was supposed to be deserted. I tried to convince myself it was just an illusion. Maybe a tree stump that looked like a person, or some weird shadow. But then I heard it. My name. Anna. It came from outside, soft and slow, like someone was whispering right against the RV's thin metal walls. I froze. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me after staring at that footage for too long. But then I heard it again, louder this time. "Anna?" I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. Just the rustle of leaves and the gentle flow of the river nearby. But as I turned to go back inside, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the RV window. It was me. But I wasn't moving. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. Just trees and shadows. When I looked back at the window, my reflection was normal again, mimicking my every move like it was supposed to. I laughed it off, trying to shake the fear crawling up my spine. Just tired, I told myself. Get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. All night, I heard faint whispers outside. Sometimes it sounded like my voice. Sometimes like my mom's. Once, I swear it was my ex, Matt, calling me by the stupid nickname he used to use, Annie. The voices felt like hooks, tugging at memories I didn't want to revisit. By morning, I was exhausted. I decided to head to the village early, get my shots, and leave before the storm clouds rolling in could trap me there. The trail was muddy from last night's rain, but I managed. As I got closer to the village, though, the forest felt off. Too quiet. Even the birds were silent. The village itself was exactly what I'd hoped for. Rotting cabins, rusted tools, and moss-covered signs. But it wasn't as empty as I thought. I found fresh footprints in the mud. Small ones, like a child's, leading between the cabins. But when I followed them, they just stopped. Like whoever made them vanished into thin air. Then I heard it again, laughter. High-pitched, echoing from one of the cabins up ahead. I should have left right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed open the creaking door, camera in hand, ready to capture whatever was inside. But the cabin was empty. Just dust, decaying furniture, and an old mirror leaning against the far wall. That's when I saw her. She was in the mirror, standing right behind me. A woman, twisted and hunched, with skin like soggy bark and eyes that gleamed like wet stones. Her mouth stretched into a grin, wide and unnatural, as she whispered, "Anna!" I spun around, but no one was there. My heart pounded in my ears as I backed away. The mirror's reflection still burned into my mind. I stumbled out of the cabin, tripping over roots and rocks until I was back at the river. That's when I realized something was wrong with the water. It was too still, like glass, reflecting the trees and sky perfectly. But when I looked closer, my reflection didn't match. It was me, but not. The reflection's eyes were wrong. Too dark, too hollow, and it was smiling. I bolted back to the RV. The sky was darkening fast, and the first drops of rain started to fall. When I reached the clearing, I saw that the river had risen, flooding the path I'd driven in on. I was trapped. Panic set in. I tried starting the RV, but the wheels were sunk in the mud. My phone had no signal, and my GPS was useless, spinning me in circles. I was stuck, alone, with something out there that knew my name. That night, the whispers didn't stay outside. They seeped in through the vents, the windows, the cracks in the walls. They filled the small space, wrapping around me like a cold, wet blanket. I curled up in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight. But the light didn't help. Shadows danced on the walls, and in every reflection, my phone screen, the RV windows, even the shine of my camera lens, I saw her. The swamp hag. She was closer now, her grin wider, her whispers louder. I felt her fingers on my skin, cold and slimy, leaving bruises where they touched. I tried to scream, but my voice felt like it belonged to someone else, echoing back at me in a chorus of fear. By morning, I was covered in scratches and bruises I didn't remember getting. My mind was unraveling, each thought slipping through my fingers like water. But I wasn't going to let her win. I grabbed my camera, determined to document everything. If I couldn't escape, At least I'd leave proof. I made my way back to the village, rain pouring down, turning the ground to sludge. I found the cabin with the mirror and smashed it, hoping to break whatever hold she had on me. But it didn't work. She appeared in the shards, her broken reflection laughing as the whispers grew into screams. I knew then that I couldn't fight her in the village. I had to confront her where she was strongest, by the river. I set a trap. I knew she fed on fear, on isolation, so I gave her what she wanted. I stood by the riverbank, letting the whispers wash over me, drawing her out. When she emerged from the water, her form shifting and rippling like liquid shadow, I snapped the camera's flash repeatedly, blinding her momentarily. It gave me just enough time. I ran, not looking back, as the forest seemed to close in around me. The storm had weakened, and I found a path leading uphill, away from the flooded river. Hours later, soaked and shivering, I stumbled into a ranger station. They didn't believe me, of course. Who would? But they found my RV half submerged in the mud, and my camera, filled with distorted, nightmarish images that didn't make sense. I thought I was safe. I thought I'd escaped. But when I got back home, I noticed something in the mirror. My reflection wasn't quite right. My eyes were too dark, too hollow, and sometimes, late at night, I hear a voice whispering from the shadows. It sounds like me. My name is Greg Morris. I'm 42 years old, and what happened to my family outside Ashland, Oregon, still haunts me every day. I wish I could say it's all behind us, but some scars don't heal. Some losses don't fade. If you ever find yourself driving down the back roads near Hollow Creek, turn around. Don't stop. Don't ask for help. It started as a simple road trip. After losing my job, I figured taking the family on an RV trip from Portland down to California would give us time to reconnect. Melissa, my wife, thought it'd be good for the kids, Aiden and Emily. I figured it'd be good for me, to clear my head. But the further south we drove, the more the silence between Melissa and me grew. The tension was thick, and even the kids picked up on it. We were somewhere outside Ashland when the RV sputtered, coughed, and died. No warning, no weird noises before, just dead. I fiddled with the ignition while Melissa checked her phone. "No signal," she muttered. I got out and lifted the hood, staring at the engine like I knew what the hell I was looking at. I didn't. The sun was dipping behind the trees, shadows stretching across the narrow road. Aiden hopped out, his curiosity always getting the best of him, while Emily clung to her stuffed rabbit, eyes darting toward the woods like they were watching her. "There's a house down the road," Melissa said, pointing to a faint dirt path that veered off into the trees. I sighed, wiped the grease off my hands. "I'll check it out. Stay here, lock the doors." Aiden begged to come, but I shook my head. "Stay with your mom." The walk wasn't far, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt longer. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots crunching on gravel. That's when I saw the sign. "Welcome to Hollow Creek." It wasn't a town, more like a cluster of old houses and one rundown gas station. The place felt off, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I spotted a garage with an old mechanic on duty sign swinging in the breeze. Inside, a man in greasy overalls tinkered with a rusted truck. "Hey," I called out. "RV broke down up the road. You got a tow?" The man looked up slowly, a grin spreading across his grime-covered face. "Sure do. Name's Jed. You're in luck. I don't usually work this late." Something about his smile didn't sit right, but I needed his help. He followed me back with a tow truck, whistling some tuneless melody the whole way. The kids watched from the RV window, wide-eyed. Back at the garage, Jed promised it was a minor fix but needed a special part. "Be ready by morning," he assured us, flashing that same unsettling grin. Melissa suggested we stay in the RV overnight, but Jed insisted the Hollow Creek Harvest Festival was happening that evening. "Best food and music you'll find around here," he said. "Bring the kids. Folks are real friendly." Something in his tone made my skin crawl, but Melissa nudged me. "It'll be fun for the kids. We're stuck here anyway." Reluctantly, I agreed. The festival was in the town square, a dusty lot with sagging banners and a bonfire that crackled too brightly against the night. The townspeople greeted us with forced smiles and hollow eyes. They were too polite, like they were reading from a script. Kids played games with dolls that looked eerily realistic, their glassy eyes gleaming in the firelight. Aiden tugged my sleeve. "Dad, look at this." He pointed to a tree nearby. Symbols, carved deep into the bark, spirals and shapes that didn't look like anything natural. Melissa tried to wave it off, but even she looked uneasy. Emily was the worst. She clutched my hand tightly, whispering, "Lila says this is a bad place." I crouched down. "Who's Lila, sweetheart?" "My friend, but she's not imaginary anymore. She's here." A cold shiver crawled down my spine. We didn't stay long. Back in the RV, Melissa whispered, "Greg, something's wrong with this place." I nodded. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." But when morning came, Jed had a different story. "Parts delayed," he shrugged. "Might be another day." I'd had enough. "We'll call for help." Jed's smile faded. "No signal out here. Besides, we're happy to have you. Why not stay another night? You'll be safe with us." Safe. That word rang in my ears long after we returned to the RV. Melissa wanted to leave, but I told her we needed to wait until dark. I didn't trust Jed or his friendly neighbors. That night I woke up to a sharp pain in my head. My hands were tied, my mouth gagged. Melissa stood over me, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Greg," she whispered. "I thought if I gave them you, they'd let the kids go." I struggled against the ropes, heart pounding. But before I could react, Jed and 2 other men dragged me from the RV. I caught a glimpse of Aiden's terrified face pressed against the window, and Emily. Emily just watched, expressionless. They hauled me to an old church at the edge of town. Inside, the walls were lined with bones, and the air stank of decay. I realized then, this wasn't just a cult. It was a slaughterhouse. Jed leaned in close. "We don't just eat to survive, Greg. We eat to live." They beat me, broke my ribs, left me hanging from the rafters like some sacrificial offering. I don't know how long I was there before Melissa returned, blood on her hands, eyes wild. "I was wrong," she whispered, cutting me down. "They're going to take the kids too." We stumbled through the woods searching for Aiden and Emily. We found Aiden in the church basement, tied to an altar, his face pale but alive. But Emily wasn't there. "She went with them," Aiden whispered, tears streaming down his face. "She said Lila wanted her to stay." We found Lena, the local woman who'd seemed friendly, fighting off the cult members near the edge of town. She helped us escape, guiding us back to the RV. But as we drove away, battered and broken, I saw Emily standing at the tree line, her stuffed rabbit in one hand, waving with the other. Her eyes were hollow. We made it to the authorities days later, but no one believed our story. They said it was shock, trauma. But I know what I saw, I know what happened. Aiden hasn't spoken since. My legs don't work right anymore. And Melissa, she barely looks at me. Months later, we got a postcard in the mail, no return address. Just a photo of Emily, standing in front of that old church in Hollow Creek, smiling. "Wish you were here." My name is Sarah Whitman. I'm 34 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened deep in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest in southern Oregon. I've camped alone in some of the most remote places in the country for my travel blog, Wild Wanderings. I've slept through bear scares, flash floods, and even a landslide in Colorado. But nothing, not a damn thing, prepared me for what happened in those woods. I was coming off a rough breakup. My ex, Tyler, said I was running from something, always on the road, always chasing solitude. Maybe he was right, but I didn't care. The forest didn't judge me, didn't ask me to be anything but present. I figured a week off-grid in Oregon would clear my head and give me fresh content for my blog. The Rogue River Siskiyou was perfect. Vast, untouched, and eerily beautiful. I drove my RV as far as the dirt roads would take me, past the last marked trailhead, until the forest swallowed the path entirely. The silence out there was different. Not peaceful, but heavy, like the trees were leaning in, listening. I parked in a small clearing near a crumbling fire ring and set up camp. The first night was uneventful, just me, the crackling fire, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But as I settled into my sleeping bag, I heard something faint. Children's laughter. High-pitched, playful, but distant. I sat up, heart racing. It was nearly midnight. There shouldn't be kids out here. I told myself it was just the wind or some nocturnal animal, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I grabbed my camera and hiked deeper into the forest, looking for good shots. The light filtered through the dense canopy in golden streams, casting long shadows on the moss-covered ground. I was a few miles from camp when I stumbled on something odd. A rusted, old campsite. The tents were collapsed, and the fabric was torn and brittle like it had been left there for decades. Scattered around were children's toys, an old tin car, a cracked doll with missing eyes, and a jump rope half buried in the dirt. Something about that scene chilled me. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt forgotten. I snapped a few photos, but my hands were shaking. When I got back to the RV, I noticed muddy handprints smeared across the windows. Small handprints like a child's. My heart pounded in my chest. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see someone, or something, watching me. But the woods were silent. I told myself it had to be some prank, maybe hikers messing with me. But I hadn't seen another soul since I'd arrived. That night, as I sat by the fire editing photos, I heard it again. Laughter, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the woods, but the beam of light only seemed to thicken the darkness between the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched prickled at my skin. I locked the RV that night. By the third day, I was starting to lose it. My compass spun uselessly in circles, and my GPS kept glitching, leading me back to the same spot no matter which direction I hiked. Supplies, I was sure I'd packed. Extra batteries, my flashlight, even my water bottle, were missing. My food stash was dwindling faster than it should have been, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That afternoon, while searching for a way out, I found a tree with a faded missing person flyer nailed to it. The paper was yellowed and brittle, barely legible, but I could make out the photo of a young boy, maybe 7 or 8, with dark hair and hollow eyes. The date on the flyer, 1953. I stared at that picture and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I knew that face. I'd seen him. In my dreams, or maybe in the woods. That night was the worst. I woke up to the sound of whispering voices just outside the RV. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them, pressing against the thin walls like the voices themselves had weight. I peeked through the blinds and my blood ran cold. Small figures darted between the trees, their movements unnatural, like they were flickering in and out of existence. Their eyes. Jesus, Their eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers in the dark. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I decided to get the hell out. I didn't care about the blog, the photos, any of it. I packed up, started the engine, and took off down the dirt road. But no matter how far I drove, the forest didn't change. The road looped endlessly, always bringing me back to that same clearing. I was trapped. Panic clawed at my chest as I slammed the brakes and screamed into the empty woods. But the only response was the faint sound of laughter, growing louder, closer. I had to do something. I grabbed my camera, thinking if I could document what was happening, maybe someone would find it. Believe me, I followed the sounds deeper into the forest, my heart pounding with every step. That's when I found it. A hidden clearing I hadn't seen before, filled with rotting toys and makeshift graves marked with crude wooden crosses. Each grave had a name carved into it, and as I read them, bile rose in my throat. They were all children's names. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. My breath fogged in front of me and the air grew thick with whispers. I spun around, but the clearing was empty. Then I heard it, right behind me. "Stay with us." I turned and saw them. Dozens of ghostly children, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes glowing in the twilight. They stared at me, unblinking, their mouths moving in silent whispers. I ran. Branches tore at my skin, roots snagged my feet, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran before I collapsed, gasping for air. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the woods anymore. I was buried. Dirt pressed against my chest, filled my mouth, clogged my nose. Only my head was above ground and I couldn't move. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest. The children surrounded me, their faces inches from mine, their whispers filling my ears. "Stay with us, forever." I don't know how I did it, but I fought. I forced myself to remember who I was, why I was here. I thought about Tyler, about the life I still had beyond these woods. I refused to give in to their whispers, and somehow they faded. I clawed my way out of the dirt and stumbled back to the RV, my body shaking, my mind a fog of terror and exhaustion. I started the engine, and this time, the road was clear. I drove until I reached a town, any town, I didn't care where. I found a gas station, stumbled inside, and begged them to call the police. But when they arrived, the officers just looked at me like I was crazy. They said no one had gone missing in that forest for decades. But I know the truth. When I finally got home, I checked my camera, hoping to find proof of what I'd seen. But the photos were different. In every picture I'd taken, there were ghostly figures in the background, pale children, staring at me with hollow eyes. And in the last photo, the one I took before I ran, I wasn't there. Just the empty forest, as if I'd never existed. Now, every night I hear the whispers. Faint, but always there. They're still calling me, and I don't know how much longer I can resist. My name is Sarah Theth. I'm 34 years old, and this happened in the summer of 2022. I'm not sure why I'm writing this down. Maybe, if I see the words on paper, I'll believe it actually happened. Maybe it's just the only way I can stop seeing their faces when I close my eyes. Mike and I were trying to save our marriage. That's what he said anyway. After his affair, we were supposed to reconnect, get away from the city, away from the noise. He thought an RV trip through the Rogue River National Forest would do the trick. Just us, the trees, and the open road. Except it wasn't just us. Jessica came along, my best friend. Or, at least, she used to be. She showed up the morning we were supposed to leave, backpack slung over one shoulder, her wide smile never reaching her eyes. "Surprise," she chirped, like this was some kind of joke. Mike didn't say a word. He just hugged her like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he hadn't begged me to forgive him for sleeping with some other woman. I didn't know it then, but that hug meant more than I realized. I should have told her to leave right then. I should have driven back to Portland, filed the divorce papers, and never looked back. But I didn't. We hit the road that afternoon, winding through the dense forests of the southern Oregon. The deeper we went, the more I felt the weight in my chest grow. No cell service, no GPS, just the trees pressing in on all sides, their branches clawing at the sky like they were trying to warn us. We stopped at this rundown gas station near the edge of the forest. That's where we met him, Dean. He was leaning against an old pickup smoking a cigarette, his eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. His face was all sharp angles, like it had been carved from stone. When we pulled up, he didn't look at us right away, just flicked his cigarette into the dirt and said, "You folks sure you want to head up that way?" Mike, ever the charming idiot, laughed. "Why? Bigfoot gonna get us?" Dean didn't laugh. He just pushed off the truck and walked over, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Things out there worse than Bigfoot," he said, voice low. "Stay on the main roads. Don't go too deep." Mike waved him off like he was just some crazy local, but I felt something in my stomach twist. Dean's eyes met mine for a split second, just long enough to send a chill down my spine. We should have listened. The first day was uneventful. We set up camp in a clearing near the river, the trees towering around us like silent sentinels. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That night, I woke up to the sound of screaming. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it was too human, too desperate. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding, and looked over at Mike. He was still asleep. I shook him awake, but he just groaned and rolled over. "Probably just coyotes," he mumbled. But coyotes don't scream like that. The next morning, I found strange symbols carved into the trees around our campsite. They looked like circles with jagged lines cutting through them, almost like a twisted sun. I pointed them out to Mike, but he shrugged. "Probably just some teenagers messing around," he said. But we were miles from the nearest town. No one else was supposed to be out here. That's when I noticed the RV's tires. Slashed. Not just flat, shredded, like someone had taken a knife to them in the middle of the night. Mike's face went pale when he saw them. "Must have hit something on the road," he muttered, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We were stranded. By the third day, the tension between us was unbearable. Mike and Jessica kept sneaking off together, their whispered conversations cutting off the moment I got too close. I wasn't stupid. I knew something was going on, but I didn't want to believe it. That evening, Mike said he was going to gather firewood. He never came back. At first, I thought he was just being an asshole, trying to scare me. But as the hours dragged on and the sun dipped below the horizon, I started to panic. Jessica and I argued about what to do. She wanted to stay put, said he'd come back when he was ready. But something in her voice didn't sit right with me. She was too calm, too smug. I decided to look for him myself. That's when I found the camcorder. It was half buried in the dirt near an old, abandoned campsite. The lens cracked and caked with mud. I brought it back to the RV, wiped it off, and hit play. The footage was shaky, but I could make out a group of people. Another couple, maybe, with a kid. They were laughing, roasting marshmallows, just like we had been. Then the screaming started. The camera tumbled to the ground, capturing quick flashes of movement. Figures in the shadows, wearing masks made of bone and bark. The last thing I saw before the tape cut out was a man's face, twisted in terror as he was dragged into the trees. I dropped the camcorder, my hands shaking. That's when Jessica confessed. She told me about the affair, about how it had started months before I found out. But that wasn't the worst part. She told me Mike had known about this place, that he'd met Dean weeks ago at a bar in Portland. Dean had told him about the adventure of a lifetime, a remote campsite deep in the Rogue River wilderness where no one could hear you scream. Mike had brought us here on purpose. Before I could react, we were ambushed. They came out of nowhere. Figures in masks, their eyes gleaming in the firelight. I tried to fight, but there were too many of them. They bound my hands, gagged me, and dragged me into the trees. I lost consciousness somewhere along the way. When I woke up, I was in a bunker, an underground room lit by flickering lanterns. The walls were covered in those same twisted symbols, the air thick with the stench of blood and rot. I saw Mike first. He was tied to a chair, his face battered and bruised, eyes swollen shut. Dean stood over him, a knife in one hand, a sick smile on his face. "You brought her here," Dean said, his voice low and gravelly. "Thought you could cheat the river, huh?" Mike tried to speak, but all that came out was a wet, gurgling sound. Jessica was there too, standing in the corner with a look of cold satisfaction on her face. She wasn't just in on it. She was part of it. "You never deserved him," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "He was mine long before you knew." Dean handed her the knife. "Your turn." She walked over to me, her eyes shining with madness. But as she raised the knife, something snapped inside me. I kicked out with all my strength, catching her in the knee. She screamed, dropping the knife. I lunged for it, my hands still bound, and managed to slice through the ropes. The next few moments were a blur. Blood, screaming, the taste of iron in my mouth. I don't even remember how I killed her. All I know is that when it was over, she was lying on the floor, her eyes wide and empty. Dean came at me next, but I was ready. I drove the knife into his side, twisting until I felt something give. He collapsed, gasping for air. I stumbled over to Mike. He was barely conscious, his breathing ragged. "Please," he whispered, "end it." I hesitated. For a moment I thought about leaving him there, letting him suffer for what he'd done. But in the end I couldn't. I pressed the knife to his throat and whispered, "You deserve worse." Then I left him there to die. I don't remember how I got out of the forest. I just remember running. Branches tearing at my skin, the sound of footsteps behind me. I don't know if it was real or just in my head. When I finally stumbled onto the road, a passing truck stopped to help me. The driver called the police, but by the time they got there, the bunker was empty. No bodies, no blood, nothing. They didn't believe me, but I know what I saw. I know what I did, and I know they're still out there, waiting. My name is Ethan Green. I'm 38 years old, and this happened in the summer of 2023. I'd like to believe none of it was real, but the scars on my arms say otherwise. I went into the Three Sisters wilderness to find peace, but what I found instead was me, or something that looked like me. After Anna died, everything blurred. She was the only person who understood me, the only one who made the silence feel less heavy. When the drunk driver ran that red light last December, it wasn't just her body they pulled from the wreckage, it was mine too. My body kept moving, but I wasn't really there. So, I bought an old RV, packed up what little I cared about, and headed for the place we used to love, the Three Sisters Wilderness in Oregon. It was Anna's favorite spot. She always said the mountains made her feel small in the best way. I thought maybe if I went back, I could hear her voice again, feel her in the wind. But the only voice I heard was my own, and eventually, even that wasn't mine anymore. The first night was uneventful. I parked the RV near a small lake we'd camped at years ago. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the sky and the jagged peaks of the sisters above. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, I felt something shift, like the forest was holding its breath. I woke in the middle of the night to a soft tapping sound. It was rhythmic, almost like someone knocking gently on glass. I sat up, my heart pounding in the darkness. The tapping continued, and I realized it was coming from the RV's window. When I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there. Just my reflection in the glass, pale and wide-eyed. But something was wrong. The reflection didn't move when I did. For a split second, it just stared back at me, a fraction of a second behind, like it was thinking about how to mimic me. I told myself it was just exhaustion. Maybe the grief was playing tricks on me. I forced myself back to sleep. The next day, I decided to hike one of the trails Anna and I had done years ago. I needed to clear my head. The forest was dense, the towering pines casting dappled shadows on the trail. After a couple of miles, I saw her. Claire. She was crouched by the side of the path, adjusting the strap on her backpack. She looked up as I approached, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Hey there," she said, standing up and brushing the dirt off her hands. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here." "Same," I replied, surprised at how dry my voice sounded. I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. We walked together for a while, our conversation light and easy. Claire was friendly, her presence a welcome distraction from the heaviness in my chest. When we got back to the campsite, I invited her to share a meal by the fire. It felt good to have company, even if just for a night. But when I woke up the next morning, Claire was gone, and things were different. My journal was open on the small table, pages torn out. My boots were wet, as if I'd been walking through the woods during the night. But I hadn't. I was sure of it, wasn't I? Later that day, I met Ranger Paul while hiking a different trail. He was a sturdy man in his 50s, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, his tone casual but with an edge of suspicion. "Yeah," I replied. "Just needed some time away." He nodded slowly. "Had some reports of folks trespassing in restricted areas. You seen anyone?" I hesitated. "No, just me." But the way he looked at me made my skin crawl, like he knew something I didn't. That night, I saw him. I was sitting by the fire when I felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched. I turned towards the woods, and there, just beyond the reach of the firelight, was me. He was standing perfectly still, his face partially hidden in the shadows. But I knew it was me. Same clothes, same posture, same dead eyes. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, and the firelight illuminated his face. My face, but it wasn't right. The expression was twisted, a cruel mockery of my own features. And then, in my voice, it spoke. "Why are you here, Ethan?" I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I blinked, and he was gone. Just vanished into the trees. I told myself I was losing it, that the grief had finally cracked me open, and all the darkness inside was spilling out. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was wrong. The next morning, Claire returned. But she wasn't the same. She was distant, her friendly demeanor replaced by something colder. She avoided my eyes, flinched when I spoke. "I saw you last night," she whispered when we were sitting by the fire again. "You were different." "I was in my RV," I insisted, my voice shaky. "I didn't leave." But she didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. And part of me didn't believe it either. That night, I woke up to the sound of screaming. It was Claire. I rushed out of the RV, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I followed the sound to her campsite, but when I got there, it was empty. Her tent was torn apart. blood staining the ground, and in the distance I heard my own voice calling her name. But I wasn't speaking. When I got back to the RV, it had been ransacked. My belongings were scattered, and the mirror above the sink was shattered. Scrawled across the wall in something dark and sticky were the words, "You don't belong here." I was unraveling. I didn't know what was real anymore. Every time I looked in a reflective surface, I saw him, my twisted double, watching me with that cold, dead smile. I tried to leave. I packed up what I could and started the RV, but it wouldn't move. The tires were flat, shredded like they'd been slashed with a knife. I was trapped. The next day, Ranger Paul showed up at my campsite. His expression was hard, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "We need to talk," he said. I tried to explain, but the words felt hollow even as they left my mouth. He didn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me either. And then he appeared. My doppelganger stepped out of the trees, his expression calm and innocent. "I don't know what he's talking about," he said, his voice my voice. Ranger Paul's eyes darted between us, confusion and fear flickering across his face, and then the double lunged. The struggle was a blur of fists and blood. Ranger Paul tried to intervene, but my double was too fast, too strong. He knocked the ranger aside like he was nothing, sending him sprawling to the ground. I fought back with everything I had, but it wasn't enough. My double pinned me down, his face inches from mine, that cruel smile widening. "This is my life now," he whispered. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to grab a shard of broken glass from the ground and drove it into his neck. He let out a guttural scream, his blood, my blood, spilling onto the dirt. But when he fell, I saw it in his eyes. It wasn't over. I stumbled over to Ranger Paul. He was still alive, barely. I tried to explain, but he just looked at me with terror in his eyes. He thought I was the double. When the authorities arrived, they found me covered in blood, standing over the ranger's body. Claire was never found. They didn't believe my story. No one would. And now, every time I look in the mirror, I see him. Waiting. I don't know if I'm still me, or if I ever was. My name is Lena Morgan. I'm 29 years old, and this happened last summer along the Oregon coast. I'm a travel blogger. Nothing fancy, just a girl with a camera and a knack for finding off-the-beaten-path spots. I live for the thrill, the hidden stories, the places people forget. But some stories aren't meant to be told. Some places don't want to be found. After my breakup with Derek, I needed to clear my head. So, I packed up my RV and hit the coast, looking for inspiration, and maybe a little distraction. That's how I ended up at Hecata Head Lighthouse. The place is gorgeous, perched on a cliff with the Pacific stretching endlessly beneath it. But there's something else about it, something you feel in your bones the moment you step out of your car. The fog rolls in thick and heavy, swallowing the edges of the world, and the waves crash against the rocks like they're trying to pull the land back into the sea. It's beautiful, sure, but it's the kind of beauty that hides sharp teeth. I set up camp at a nearby site, close enough to the lighthouse to walk, but far enough that I wouldn't have to deal with tourists. The goal was to get some sunrise shots, maybe a moody blog post about the coast's haunted history. I'd heard the stories, the gray lady, the ghost who supposedly haunts the lighthouse. But ghost stories are a dime a dozen on the coast. I thought it'd make for good content. I didn't believe in any of it. I should have. The first person I met was Tom, an old fisherman with skin like leather and eyes that never quite met yours. I ran into him at the local marina when I stopped for supplies. "You're staying near the lighthouse?" he asked, his voice like gravel. "Yeah," I said, smiling, "trying to catch the perfect shot." He didn't smile back. stay away from it after dark. I laughed, thinking he was just another superstitious local trying to scare the city girl. Why? Ghosts gonna get me? His eyes finally met mine, and there was nothing playful in them. Ghosts would be better. I left without asking any more questions. That evening, I hiked up to the lighthouse, camera in hand. The fog had rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen, muting the world into shades of gray. The lighthouse loomed out of it like a ghost itself, its light sweeping across the endless mist. That's when I met Jessica. She was sitting on a rock near the edge of the cliff, sketching in a little notebook. She looked up as I approached, her face bright with a friendly smile. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. "Creepy, more like," I replied, and she laughed. We hit it off instantly. She was another solo traveler, backpacking up the coast, and we bonded over our mutual love for weird, creepy places. When I told her about my blog, her eyes lit up. "Ever hear about the witch?" she asked, lowering her voice conspiratorially. I frowned. "You mean the Gray Lady?" Jessica shook her head. "No, not her, older than that. Before the lighthouse was even built, they say a woman lived here, practiced dark magic, cursed the land. The townsfolk burned her alive on the cliffs, but she never really left. It sounded like the kind of story you hear in every small town, but there was something about the way Jessica told it that sent a chill down my spine. "We should check it out," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Tonight." I hesitated. I wasn't scared, not really, but something about the fog, the waves, the way Tom had looked at me, it all felt heavier now. But I wasn't about to back down. "Sure," I said, "let's do it." We met back at the lighthouse after dark, flashlights in hand. The place was closed off to tourists, but Jessica had found a way in through a broken window on the side. The inside smelled of salt and mildew, the air thick and cold. Our footsteps echoed off the walls as we explored, our lights casting long, twisting shadows. Then we found it. An old, sealed-off room in the basement. The door was rotted, but still barely holding, and strange symbols were carved deep into the wood and stone around it. They looked ancient, jagged, like they'd been burned into the walls. Jessica grinned. This must be it. Before I could stop her, she shoved the door open. Inside, the air felt heavier, colder. In the center of the room, on a crumbling pedestal, was a rusted pendant. A jagged piece of metal shaped like an eye, with a small stone set in the center that almost seemed to pulse. "Take a picture," Jessica whispered. But I didn't. Instead, I reached out and picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the metal, the room seemed to tilt, the air pressing down on my chest. I felt dizzy, like I'd been spun in circles, and for a moment, I thought I heard whispering. Low, guttural, and right in my ear. I stuffed the pendant into my pocket, trying to shake off the feeling. We left the lighthouse, laughing nervously, but something felt off. The fog was thicker now, so thick I could barely see Jessica walking beside me. The waves sounded louder, closer, like they were chasing us. When we got back to our campsites, we promised to meet in the morning. But when I woke up, Jessica was gone. Her tent was still there, her backpack, her sketchbook, but she was nowhere to be found. I called for her, searched the nearby trails, but there was no sign of her. It was like she'd vanished into the fog. I went to Ranger Davis, hoping he could help. He was a tall, serious man with sharp eyes that reminded me of Tom's. "She probably just moved on," he said when I explained. "Without her stuff?" I asked, my voice rising. "Her phone's still here, her clothes, something's wrong." He promised to look into it, but I could tell he didn't believe me, or maybe he didn't want to. That night, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, the waves. but then I heard my name, soft and insistent, like someone was standing just outside the RV. Lena. I looked out the window and saw her. A woman, standing in the fog, her face hidden beneath long, wet hair. She was wearing a tattered dress that clung to her body like seaweed, and her skin was gray, mottled, like she'd been pulled from the ocean floor. I blinked, and she was gone. But the whispers stayed. Over the next few days, reality started to fray. I'd find my things moved, my photos from the lighthouse distorted, faces appearing in the fog, eyes staring from the corners. My reflection in the RV's window would smile when I wasn't. I tried to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, choked, and died, no matter what I did. My phone was dead, and every time I tried to hike out, the fog would close in, disorienting me, turning me back towards the lighthouse. And then I found Jessica's phone in the woods, smashed and half buried in the dirt. That's when I knew. She hadn't left. She'd been taken. I went back to Tom, desperate for answers. He listened quietly, his face grim. "You shouldn't have taken anything from that lighthouse," he said when I finished. "She's bound to it. Taking that pendant, you woke her up." "What does she want?" I whispered. He shook his head. "To replace you, to pull you into her world so she can walk in yours." I didn't sleep that night. The whispers grew louder, the woman's face appearing in every reflective surface. She was wearing my face now, her smile wide and unnatural. I knew what I had to do. I had to put the pendant back. I returned to the lighthouse one final time. The fog was suffocating, the waves deafening. Inside, the walls seemed to pulse with the same sick rhythm as the pendant in my pocket. The air grew colder with every step, the whispers rising to a chorus of voices I couldn't understand. When I reached the sealed room, the door was gone, the walls crumbling away into darkness. She was waiting for me, standing in the center of the room, her face flickering between mine and hers. "Give it back," I whispered. She didn't move. I stepped forward, the pendant burning hot in my hand. But the closer I got, the harder it was to breathe. My vision blurred, my legs trembling under me. Finally, I threw the pendant at her feet and screamed. The room exploded in a rush of wind and sound, the walls shaking, the voices screaming in my ears. And then, silence. I woke up on the cliffs, the sun rising over the ocean. The lighthouse was quiet, the fog finally lifting. I thought it was over, but when I got back to the RV, I caught my reflection in the window, and she was still smiling. My name is Caleb Foster. I'm 42 years old, and this happened last fall in the Steens Mountain wilderness of southeastern Oregon. I thought I was getting away from my problems, taking a break from the noise and pressure of city life. I didn't realize I was walking straight into something worse, something I can't explain and will never escape. I just lost my job at a tech firm in Portland. Downsizing, they called it, but I knew the truth. I wasn't cut out for that world anymore. So I bought a used RV, packed what little I needed, and headed into the wilderness. I figured a week alone in the high desert would clear my head, maybe even help me figure out what to do next. The Steens were supposed to be beautiful, untouched, isolated. That's what I wanted. Isolation. I should have known better. I pulled into a gas station near the base of the mountain, the last one for miles. The place was almost empty, just a single pump and a sagging roof under the weight of years of dust and wind. As I filled up, an old man stepped out from behind the station, wiping his hands on a rag. "You heading up the mountain?" he asked, squinting at me like he was trying to see something beneath my skin. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Looking for some peace and quiet." He grunted, shaking his head. "You'll find quiet, all right. Too much of it, maybe." He glanced at the mountain, the shadows already stretching long across the landscape. Stay clear of the ridges after dark. Things out there don't like being watched. I laughed it off. What, coyotes? He didn't laugh back. Ain't coyotes. I left him standing there, staring at the mountain like it owed him something. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was low in the sky, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. The desert stretched out endlessly, the mountain rising like a jagged tooth against the horizon. It was exactly what I needed. No people, no noise, just me and the open air. That first night was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no animals, not even the distant hum of insects. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the RV settling into the earth. When I woke the next morning, there were footprints around the RV. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were wrong. Too large. The toes elongated and splayed like something wasn't meant to walk upright. I stared at them for a long time, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a bear, but the prints were too human, and they circled the RV over and over like someone or something had been watching me. I convinced myself it was nothing. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the wilderness. That's what I told myself. That's what I believed. Until I met Sarah. I ran into her on a trail near the base of the mountain later that day. She was crouched by a stream, filling a water bottle, and looked up when she heard me approach. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," she said, smiling. "Same," I replied. "I thought I was the only one crazy enough to camp out here alone," she laughed, the sound echoing off the rocks. "Guess we're both a little crazy." We talked for a while, swapping stories about our reasons for being out there. She was a solo hiker, working her way through Oregon's wilderness areas. She mentioned hearing strange noises at night, but shrugged it off. "Probably just the wind," she said. But I knew it wasn't the wind. We parted ways after an hour, promising to catch up if we crossed paths again. I never saw her alive after that. That night, the shadows returned. I was sitting by the fire, staring out at the darkening landscape when I saw them. Figures standing just beyond the circle of light, motionless and silent. They weren't animals. They were tall, human-shaped, but their edges blurred and shifted like smoke. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, watching as they stood there staring at me. When I finally worked up the nerve to shine my flashlight at them, they were gone. Just vanished into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I found Sarah's campsite, or what was left of it. Her tent was shredded, her belongings scattered like she'd left in a hurry or been taken. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, but her pack, her shoes, even her water bottle were still there. No one leaves without their shoes. I radioed for help using the emergency beacon I'd packed just in case. A few hours later, Deputy Ross arrived, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and tired eyes. "You say you saw shadows?" he asked after I explained everything. I nodded. "They weren't animals, they were people, or something like people." He scratched his chin, glancing at the mountain. "Folks around here talk about things like that. Shadows that move when they shouldn't, people going missing. But most of it's just stories." "This wasn't a story," I snapped. "Sarah's gone. There were footprints around my RV. Something's out there." He sighed, like he'd heard this all before. "I'll file a report, but chances are she just wandered off. Happens more than you'd think." But I knew she hadn't just wandered off. That night, I reviewed the footage on my camera, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. What I found made my blood run cold. There, on the screen, was me. Walking out of the RV in the middle of the night, barefoot, my eyes open but empty. I moved like I was being pulled by something, my body stiff and unnatural. I had no memory of it. And behind me, in the distance, were the shadows, watching. I tried to leave the next morning. I packed up, started the RV, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could. But no matter how far I drove, the road kept looping back. I'd see the same twisted tree, the same rock formation, the same shadow of the mountain looming over me. My GPS was useless, spinning in circles, and my compass pointed nowhere. I was trapped. That night, the shadows came closer. They surrounded the RV, their forms pressing against the windows, their whispers seeping through the walls. They didn't speak in words, but I could feel them in my head, twisting my thoughts, pulling at my mind. When I looked out the window, I saw Sarah's face staring back at me, her eyes hollow and dark, but it wasn't her. It was one of them, wearing her face like a mask. I knew then that they weren't just shadows. They were something older, something that had been here long before me, before any of us, and they wanted me to join them. I couldn't fight them. The more I tried, the stronger they became. The only way to survive was to stop acknowledging them, to pretend they weren't there. But it's hard to ignore something when it's standing right in front of you, whispering your name in your own voice. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was stepping out of the RV, my body moving on its own, my mind screaming for control. I woke up in a hospital in Burns, Oregon, a week later. They found me wandering near the base of the mountain, dehydrated and delirious. No sign of Sarah, no sign of the RV, no evidence of anything I'd seen. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, but I don't feel lucky, because even now, sitting in my apartment, surrounded by the noise of the city, I see them. In the corners of my vision, in the shadows that stretch just a little too long, in the reflection of my windows at night. They're still watching, and they're waiting.